ever get the feeling that neoliberalism is one of those words people throw around without really knowing what it means?
Definitely.
Like, we know it's a thing, but
It's a real Rorschach test.
what kind of thing?
People just project all their own baggage onto it.
Which is why we're going deep on this one.
Right.
You sent over these excerpts from Masters of the Universe, and it's like getting a behind-the-scenes look at how this whole neoliberal ideology went from a fringe idea to kind of running the world.
Well, and that's what's so fascinating about this book, right? I mean, it really gets into the strategy behind it.
Okay.
You know, we're not just talking about a few scattered thinkers. Like, this was a deliberate network that was incredibly effective at spreading its influence.
Okay, so this book is focused on like the post-WWII era.
Yeah, so it's really looking at what they call the second phase of neoliberalism. And the reason they make that distinction is because, you know, the earliest thinkers were really mostly concerned with, you know, critiquing some aspects of the welfare state, arguing for a more limited role for government, right? But the second wave, this is where it gets much bolder.
Yeah.
This is where they truly believe that free markets are the answer to almost everything.
So who are these movers and shakers?
Well,
give us the neoliberal all-stars.
Yeah, you got to start with Hayek and Friedman, of course.
Right.
These are the giants in the field.
Right.
But it goes beyond them.
Okay.
You've got Mises, Buchanan, Stigler.
Okay.
These were the intellectual heavyweights that were really shaping this movement.
And what do they all have in common, aside from, like, probably amazing bookshelves?
Yeah, well, at their core was this shared belief in individual liberty as being like the ultimate goal.
Okay.
Right. And they saw government intervention as the biggest threat to that liberty.
Okay.
And so therefore, free markets with minimal interference, this is how you promote both prosperity and freedom.
But these weren't just like armchair intellectuals, right?
Yeah.
The book really emphasizes how they were surprisingly strategic about actually spreading these ideas.
Yeah, and that's what makes this so fascinating.
Yeah.
Like, take Hayek, for example, right? He was very influenced by, and this is kind of ironic, but the Fabian socialists.
Oh, wow.
In that he understood the power of changing the intellectual landscape.
So instead of trying to, like, win elections right away, it was more about playing the long game.
Exactly.
Okay.
He believed that if you could convince the intellectuals, the writers, the journalists, the professors, eventually those ideas would filter down to the policymakers, to the public at large.
Sneaky. But also kind of brilliant.
It worked.
It did work, yeah.
And then you have Friedman, who, if Hayek was the architect, Friedman was the master communicator.
Right.
He had this incredible knack for taking complex economic theory and making it accessible, even appealing to a much wider audience.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy won a Nobel Prize in economics.
And Capitalism and Freedom, his book from '62.
Huge.
That felt like a real turning point.
It was, because he drew this really compelling connection between economic freedom and political freedom.
Right.
Which at the height of the Cold War was a really resonant message.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got these big thinkers.
Yeah.
But ideas don't spread themselves.
They don't, no.
The book makes a really big deal about how this whole neoliberal push was a team effort.
Oh, absolutely. This was a deliberate, coordinated effort. And the key to understanding that is this guy, Anthony Fisher.
Okay, so who was he in the neoliberal boy band?
He's like the manager.
Okay.
Right, the one who made it all happen.
Okay.
He was obsessed with Hayek's ideas, and he wanted to put them into action.
Okay.
But he realized to win the battle of ideas, you need institutions. You need think tanks to actually champion these ideas.
And he was not messing around.
No.
He helped set up some big-time think tanks.
Huge. The Institute of Economic Affairs in Britain. He plays a role in supporting the American Enterprise Institute.
Wow.
These were not just academic talking shops.
More like neoliberal war rooms.
In a way, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, they took these complex academic theories and they crafted them into digestible, actionable policy proposals that politicians could actually use.
Oh, wow.
They became this vital bridge between the world of ideas and the messy reality of politics.
So they were like translators, taking this really dense jargon and making it make sense for the folks who are actually making policy.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
And they were really savvy about it, too.
Okay.
They knew that they had to frame these ideas in a way that resonated with the concerns of the day.
Right.
So they became very, very effective at tailoring their message to the political climate.
Which is where it gets even more interesting, right? Because this wasn't just a right-wing thing. The book talks about how even the so-called left started getting in on the neoliberal action.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions out there, I think, is that people tend to think of neoliberalism as purely a right-wing phenomenon.
Right.
The reality is much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
And it really comes down to the context of the 1970s.
Things were a little chaotic in the 70s.
Let's put it mildly.
Yeah.
I mean, you had this perfect storm of economic problems.
Right.
High inflation, slow growth, high unemployment.
Yeah.
Stagflation, they called it.
Right.
In the old Keynesian playbook, you know, government spending to stimulate the economy, that wasn't really working anymore.
So there's this sense of, like, panic.
Right.
The old tools aren't working. What do we do?
Yeah.
And that's the opening that these neoliberal thinkers needed.
Exactly. It created this window of opportunity for their ideas to gain traction, even among people who might not have considered themselves, you know, free market evangelists before.
And we're talking about people like, say, Jimmy Carter.
Even Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, embracing these ideas.
Wow.
He might not have loved the label neoliberal.
Right.
But he did embrace deregulation in key industries.
Right.
Like transportation and banking.
Okay.
And remember, Paul Volcker,
Yeah.
his pick to head the Federal Reserve,
Right.
a tough inflation fighter,
Right.
very much in line with this neoliberal thinking.
Wow. And it wasn't just a U.S. thing, right?
No, not at all.
The book talks about how Britain was going through the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. Even Labour Party prime ministers in Britain,
Right.
guys like Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, they started making some pretty significant moves toward this new way of thinking.
Wow.
I mean, they were under immense pressure to deal with this economic crisis.
So they're cutting spending.
Yeah.
Backing away from those classic labor policies, like full employment.
In many ways, yes.
Wow.
It was seen as necessary, even if it meant going against some of their traditional principles, right?
Right.
It shows you how persuasive these ideas had become.
So it really makes you realize this wasn't just a fringe movement anymore.
Yeah.
Like, this was becoming mainstream.
It was becoming the mainstream, but then the 1980s hit.
Right.
And that's when things really take off.
Right.
This is when neoliberalism goes from influencing policy to, in many ways, defining it.
Enter stage.
Right.
Reagan and Thatcher.
The Reagan-Thatcher revolution, as it's often called, right?
Right.
This was the culmination of decades of work by these neoliberal thinkers and the network that they built.
Right. Because they were both incredibly committed to free markets, shrinking the size and scope of government.
Absolutely.
And they didn't just talk about it. They governed that way.
They did. And it's important to remember they don't come up with these ideas in a vacuum.
Right.
They surrounded themselves with advisors who had been steeped in this philosophy for years.
We're talking about people like Alan Greenspan,
Yeah.
Milton Friedman himself.
Yep, and a whole host of other folks who came up through these think tanks we were talking about earlier.
Right.
These were the people whispering in the ears of power, the architects of the policies that would come to define the 1980s and beyond.
So what were some of their signature moves? What did this neoliberal revolution actually look like in practice?
Well, tax cuts were a big one, especially for Reagan.
Right.
Remember the Laffer curve?
Yeah.
The idea that cutting taxes could actually increase government revenue by stimulating economic growth?
Sounds too good to be true.
It's a controversial theory, to say the least.
Yeah.
But it was very influential at the time, and it gave a lot of intellectual ammunition to this push for lower taxes.
Okay.
Deregulation was another major pillar of this.
Okay.
Particularly in the financial industry.
Right.
Thatcher was all about breaking up state-owned monopolies and letting the magic of the free market work its will.
Which, in retrospect, is a little ironic given what we know about how things played out.
Right.
But that's a story for another deep dive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also worth pointing out that even though Reagan and Thatcher were incredibly successful at pushing their agenda,
Right.
they didn't win every battle.
Right.
Shrinking the welfare state proved to be a lot tougher than they anticipated.
Yeah, because it turns out people actually kind of liked some of those programs.
They did, and
Yeah.
those programs had powerful constituencies who fought hard to protect them.
Right.
So while the neoliberal revolution had a profound impact,
Yeah.
it wasn't a complete and total victory.
Still, the legacy is pretty hard to ignore.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they fundamentally shifted the terms of the debate.
Right.
After Reagan and Thatcher, free markets became the default solution for almost every problem.
Right.
And that way of thinking has had a lasting impact, even on those who might not consider themselves neoliberal.
It's like their ideas seeped into the water supply or something. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? How these ideas went from like a few academics having coffee to reshaping like the economic landscape on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And the book really doesn't shy away from that.
Yeah.
Masters of the Universe really drives home that point, that neoliberalism wasn't just some abstract theory.
Right.
It had and continues to have a very real impact on people's lives.
Yeah. And here's the thing that's been rattling around in my brain.
Yeah.
We've been talking about economics.
Right.
We've been talking about policy.
Right.
But this feels bigger,
Yeah,
you know?
it does, yeah.
Like this way of thinking about markets,
yeah.
about freedom, did it bleed into how we see ourselves? Like on a fundamental level?
That's the question the book hints at, but doesn't really fully unpack, right?
Yeah.
It's like neoliberalism starts as this critique of economic policy.
Right.
But does it end up shaping our entire culture?
Right. Because if you buy this idea that, like, the individual is king,
right,
and we're all, like, basically mini entrepreneurs competing in this giant marketplace of life,
right,
that changes your perspective on a lot of things, right?
Well, it does.
Not just taxes and regulation.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how much of our current emphasis on individual responsibility, on self-reliance, even on things like personal branding and self-optimization, is really rooted in this kind of neoliberal worldview that we've all inherited.
It's like instead of citizens of a country, maybe we've become consumers in this giant free market society.
Yeah. Where everything's a transaction.
Right, and that raises some interesting questions, I think, that go beyond the scope of what Masters of the Universe covers.
It does.
Right. Like what happens when you apply market logic to everything?
Right.
Healthcare, education, even relationships.
What are the unintended consequences?
What happens to the things that don't fit neatly into that model? Right?
Yeah.
Like community, compassion.
Right.
The idea of a common good. Like,
are those things valued?
Yeah. Are those things even valued?
Or do they get squeezed out?
Right, by this, like, relentless focus on individual achievement and competition.
Exactly.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. Masters of the Universe definitely opened my eyes to how this small group of thinkers really did reshape the world.
They did.
But it also left me with this much bigger question.
Yeah.
How much has this neoliberal ideology, for better or for worse, shaped not just our economic systems, but our very understanding of what it means to be human in the 21st century? I think that's something I'm going to be pondering for quite a while.
Yeah, me too. It's a big one.
It's a big one. And that's why we do these deep dives.
That's right. That's right.
Thanks for listening, everybody.